when a pregnant lady who was using a wheelchair was beaten by a police officer. The officer did not realize who her husband was. What occurred next stunned everyone. If you are interested in finding out how everything turned out, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you are seeing this. From the sun hung high in the sky, sending a warm golden glow over the Bueling amusement park, the air was filled with the sounds of children's laughing, the joyous shouts of passengers on roller coasters, and the rhythmic hum of carnival music. It was a great summer day in which everything appeared to exude delight amongst this vivid environment. Maria maneuvered her wheelchair down the broad paths of the park, her hands holding the wheels as she made her way toward the entrance. Maria, a black lady in her late 30s, was in the latter phases of her rehabilitation. A tough pregnancy problems had made it essential for her to use a wheelchair for the last several months, and she had learned to manage the obstacles of mobility with grace. Today was supposed to be a special day, and her husband Derek, who was an FBI agent, had promised to meet her and have a conversation with her. Maria had made the decision to get a head start in order to guarantee that their small son Jordan could enjoy the rides and activities without having to wait as they neared the area. This decision was made after they had finished some essential job and had arrived at the park later. Allocated for guests with disabilities, Maria had a burst of resolve. She was determined to provide Jordan with a day filled with joy, even if it meant coping with the weariness that comes with the pressure of pregnancy. Her son strolled beside her. His enthusiasm was contagious, and Maria couldn't help but grin at him. Jordan asked his mother, "Mom, can we go to the big Ferris wheel?" while pulling at his sleeve. His eagerness was visible in his bright eyes, and he periodically ran ahead of the crowd and then circled back. "Of her outfit, of course, love. But we have to acquire a special pass first," Maria said, while driving the wheelchair down a side route that led to the accessible entrance. The walk was calmer away from the main throng, and the trees that lined it were a nice touch, offered some much-needed shade as they approached the entrance to the section that was allocated for persons with disabilities. Maria observed a security guard standing by the gate with his arms crossed over his chest, and his stare fixed on her with an attitude that made her feel as if she was being watched. Maria felt concerned because he was a middle-aged guy with a large frame, and there was something about the way he looked at her that was suspicious, almost scornful. This caused her to feel apprehensive, and she pushed ahead while maintaining a courteous tone of speech. "While she was saying hello, we were here to acquire admission to the ride area. I have my paperwork with me if you need them." The guard did not move to meet them. Instead, he looked down at Maria and then at Jordan before giving a tiny shake of his head. "Sure you're in the correct place," he said, his tone gruff and unpleasant. "This section is for those who genuinely need it." Maria's grin faded as the meaning of his words set in. She took a careful breath, telling herself to be calm. "I do need it," she replied, holding out a packet that included her medical paperwork. "I am pregnant and needing a wheelchair due to issues." The guard barely looked at the folder. "You don't seem like you need it that bad," he replied with his eyes narrowing. "We've had a lot of people come through here." Jordan felt his mother's anguish and stepped closer to her, his little hand holding the handle of the door. He was attempting to take advantage of the system recently, and you would be amazed at what some people would do for special treatment. The rejection in his voice hurt Jordan. "Wheelchair." Maria tightened her hold on the folder as she felt a combination of fury and worry rise in her chest. She looked down at Jordan and then back at the guard while maintaining a firm voice. "I understand your concerns, but I'm not trying to take advantage of you," she said. Whatever she said, her voice was forceful but controlled. "I have the right to use this entry, and I can show you my medical certificates if you need to check them." The guard's attitude did not soften. If anything, his stare became harder. He took a step closer and looked down at the ground. Her with a sneer, "You know, some people believe that they can have everything they want simply because they claim they have a problem," he added. "But we have to make sure that those who really need it receive it." Maria's patience was running thin, but she didn't want to give in to her frustration. Make a disturbance, especially not in front of her son. She opened the folder to show him the medical paperwork. "Here are my papers," she replied. extending them toward the guard while saying, "You can see for yourself." The guard gave the documents a cursory glance before shaking his head. It wasn't only the guard's rejection that hurt Maria's feelings. It was also the way he talked to her as if she were a child. He stated that anybody can get a doctor to sign off on anything, but I need to see more than just some papers. Maria's heart plummeted. Attempting to fool him as if she did not belong, the tension was obvious now, and a few other visitors started to notice the interaction. She looked about, noticing the curious stares of passers-by who were now directing their attention toward the unfolding of events. She was trying to deceive him. Her chest clenched with a mixture of anger and shame. "Please," she pleaded, striving to maintain her calm. "I'm not trying to create any problems. I'm just here to enjoy the day with my kid." But the guard, she wasn't able to retain her cool throughout the situation. The guy was already shaking his head once again. "I think I'm going to have to call this in," he said, removing a radio from his belt. "We've had too many people trying to cheat the system lately, and it's better to be safe." Maria's heart rate sped as she heard the words, and her thoughts raced as she tried to figure out what may have happened. She looked down at Jordan, who was now grasping the wheelchair even more tightly. His little face was filled with fear, and he muttered, "Mommy, is everything okay?" Maria offered him a comforting smile even as she looked down at him. She thought about how to diffuse the situation before it went further. Despite the fact that her own nervousness was growing, she told her, "It's okay, sweetie. We're just trying to figure out something." As the guard talked into his radio, asking for assistance, Maria experienced a wave of fury and powerlessness. She had told her that she had presented her paperwork and that she had explained her situation to her. Scenario, and yet it was not enough. It was as if he had already determined that she was attempting to mislead him. Just because she was a black lady in a wheelchair, she could feel the weight of the steps from the observers, could hear the faint whispers of those who were watching the incident. She could see the people who were watching the event. Maria's heart fell even deeper as she heard a voice crackling over the guard's radio, indicating that a police officer would be there soon. She had wanted to avoid engaging the authorities since she was aware of how unexpected things may force her mind to rush back to tales she had heard in the past. She had heard accounts of individuals who had been mistreated or even hurt during regular meetings with police enforcement, and she did not want Jordan to be a witness to anything like that. However, it seemed that there was no going back now that the guard had returned the radio to his possession. He wore his belt and crossed his arms once again, his gaze still stern and inflexible. He added, "You can wait right here until the office offer arrives, and we'll get this sorted out." Maria's fists were gripped on the wheels of her chair, knuckles growing white as she pushed herself to remain cool. There was no option but to wait. She had gone to the park looking for a day of joy, but now she found herself on the verge of a confrontation, one that she hadn't expected and wasn't sure how to handle. She had come to the park expecting for a day of joy. While she was sitting there with Jordan at her side, the commotion of the amusement park appeared to fade into the background, leaving only the anxiety that was hanging thick in the air. The seconds seemed to drag on for hours as Maria waited by the entrance, and the weight of dread began to settle heavily in. As her chest, Jordan stood close to her and anxiously looked about. She reached out to stroke his arm in an attempt to portray a sense of tranquility that she did not feel. Meanwhile, her mind were racing with fear about what may occur. Soon after, the flashing lights of a police cruiser were apparent in the distance, and the crowd started to mutter, directing their attention toward the oncoming vehicle. As the vehicle drove up to the curb, an officer stepped from the vehicle, and he was a member of the emergency response team. He was a guy with wide shoulders, a square jaw, and an expression of irritation on his face. His name tag read, J. Thompson, and as he strode toward Maria, his attitude changed from one of indifference to one of thinly disguised scorn. The guard promptly approached him. In spite of the fact that Maria was unable to hear every word, the officer's eyes fell on Maria, and he gave a little shake of his head, as if he had already made a decision before speaking to her. "Ma'am." He started by describing the problem in a low voice, but she was unable to hear every word. a voice that resounded with authority. "I've been informed that there is an issue here. You're using a wheelchair to get entry to this area. But there seems to be some doubt about the validity of your requirement." Maria's jaw clenched as she heard this, an authoritative voice. When she took a deep breath and tried to keep her voice calm, she added, "I've shown the guard my medical documents." She then held up the folder once more and continued, "I'm pregnant and experiencing complications that make it difficult for me to carry the pregnancy to term. Unable to walk, which is why I require the wheelchair." But the Officer Thompson's expression did not change. Rather, he looked down at the documents and then looked back up at her with a raised eyebrow. He said that anyone can get a doctor's note. I informed her that we've had too many individuals attempting to cheat the system. He stated, his voice loud enough for the bystanders to hear you. The guard, who was encouraged by the officer's appearance, weighed in with a contemptuous tone. "You'll have to do better than that," he added. "Be astonished at what people would do to gain preferential treatment." Maria felt a flare of fury rising in her chest. It wasn't just that they were questioning her honesty, it was the way that they talked to her, as if she were innately suspicious, as if her word and her actions were not trustworthy. She understood that it wasn't only about her being in a wheelchair, it was also about her being a black woman, and that hurt her even more. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, and she said, "I'm not trying to cheat anything." Her paperwork was useless. "I'm here with my kid to enjoy the park, and I have every right to be here." Officer Thompson's glare became more icy. "If that's the case, then why don't you get up and show me that you really need that chair?" he asked, his voice tinged with a challenge. "If you are honestly unable to walk, then you deserve to be here." It shouldn't be hard to prove. The word struck Maria like a slap. She felt a mix of humiliation and anger coursing through her. It wasn't just that he was questioning her, but that he was openly demanding she performed some kind of test to prove her need, as if she were a criminal on trial. "I can't stand up," she said through. "As I clenched my teeth and told you, I'm encountering issues that make it risky for me to walk." The officer moved closer to me, and his voice took on a more menacing tone. "Well, I'm beginning to believe you're just trying to create a scene," he added. "And if you don't comply, you might be arrested." Maria's hands were firmly gripping the arms of her wheelchair as she was placed under arrest for hindering an investigation. She was unable to believe what she was hearing. It seemed as if every word she spoke was being twisted into something that could be used against her, and it didn't matter how she tried to explain it. Rational she tried to be, it wasn't going to matter. Her pulse raced and she could feel the heat rising in her face. "I'm not obstructing anything," she whispered, her voice cracking with fury. "I'm just trying to explain." "But officer," she was trying to explain it to me. Thompson interrupted her and said, "I've had enough of your excuses." He then screamed, "Now either get up and prove you need that chair, or I'll have to escort you out of the park." His hand went toward the cuffs on his belt, and a few people in the crowd gasped. Jordan's voice, which was soft and filled with anxiety, can be heard breaking through the atmosphere of the tent. "Mommy, what is going on? Are they going to take you away?" His wide eyes stared up at her tears, which were beginning to tug at the corners of her eyes. The sound of her crying was audible. It seemed as if the sound of her son's voice brought Maria back to herself. She went to Jordan and softly stroked his hair in an effort to soothe him, even as her own panic mounted. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," she said, even though she wasn't sure if she was able to believe it. The officer looked down at Jordan, his attitude becoming even more resolute. He said, "Who is this?" And then he added, "Is your son involved in whatever is going on here?" Maria's protective instincts surged up, and she decided to keep him out of the conversation. She responded forcefully, her eyes sparkling with defiance. "He's just a child." Officer Thompson's demeanor remained stony as he stated, "If you don't comply, we may have to take measures to ensure both your safety and his." He indicated that these actions may be used in order to protect both of them. Include bringing him into jail, till we figure out what to do about this menace that hung in the air like a black cloud. Maria's pulse hammered in her chest, as she digested the magnitude of the problem. It wasn't only her safety that was at peril, now they were also in danger. She felt a flood of hopelessness wash over her, but below it, a rush of resolve started to develop. This was not simply a misunderstanding. It was an actual assault on her rights and her dignity. She felt as if she was being threatened to remove her kid as well. I couldn't allow them to do this to her or to Jordan. She took a shaky breath and stared squarely at Officer Thompson. "You're treating me like a criminal," she remarked, her voice shaking but becoming stronger. "All I've done is try to use the accessible entrance," she pointed out. "I have every right to do so. I have presented you with my paperwork. I have explained my position. There is no need to treat me in this manner." The officer sneered, his hand still hanging near his cuffs. "As if I had said, 'I don't believe you.'" He responded, "I don't believe you." By this point, the throng that was around them had grown greatly, and whispers of discontent were beginning to spread. Several individuals had pulled out their phones to photograph the situation, and a few observers were even yelling words of displeasure. "If you do not cooperate, we will have no option but to take you in." A voice of support for Maria screamed out, "Leave her alone, she hasn't done anything wrong." Another voice yelled, "This is discrimination!" For a brief time, Maria believed that the police may back down in the face of public criticism, but the officer did not. He appeared to get more confident. "You folks need to mind your own business." He screamed at the crowd. "We're addressing a crisis here." He leaned down and seized the handle of Maria's wheelchair. Harshly pushing it backward, the unexpected action startled her. Maria tried to hold herself stable as the world appeared to whirl around her. Jordan shouted out in terror, grasping her leg as if he was trying to protect her. The body caused her to cry in agony and grab for the arms of the chair to prevent herself from falling. With her breath coming in short, shallow spurts, she looked up at the officer, her eyes flaming with a combination of terror and defiance. She would not allow them to do this to her, not here, not in front of her kid, but as she opened her lips to speak, she swore to herself that she would not let it. "Speak." Her voice wavered, and all that came out was a hoarse murmur. Just then, the sound of a vehicle door slamming shut in the distance reached her ears. She turned her head and saw a familiar figure running toward them, and it was Derek. He was someone she had seen before. Moving with a feeling of hurry, his face a mask of controlled rage, Maria's pulse raced with a mixture of relief and anxiety as Derek neared the situation, appeared to teeter on the brink of something far more deadly, and she could only hope that his presence would bring about a change in the situation. Derek's steps were swift and purposeful as he approached the scene. He had seen the gathering crowd and heard the commotion from across the park par, and the sight of Maria's wheelchair surrounded by police officers had sent a wave of panic crashing through him now. Be enough to change the course of events, Derek's steps were swift and purposeful. He was getting closer, and his pulse was pounding with a combination of rage and terror. The expression on Maria's face, which was one of helplessness and defiance, only served to feed the fire that was already there inside him. "Hey!" Derek screamed, his voice piercing through the murmur of the throng. "What do you think?" "You think you're doing that?" Officer Thompson, who was still holding the handle of Maria's wheelchair, turned his head toward the sound of the voice. His expression became even more resolute, as if he had been anticipating a confrontation. He then let go of the wheelchair handle. The wheelchair was standing up as he faced Derek, who was now just a few feet away. "Sir, I need you to stay back," Thompson said, his tone dripping with authority and contempt. "We're dealing with a situation here," Derek responded, his eyes not slowing down as he approached. Jerked between the officer and Maria, who was holding the armrests of her wheelchair with such force that her knuckles became white. Jordan stood next to her, his face streaked with tears, and he desperately clung to his mother's leg. The sight of his son's anguish caused Dirk's anger to flare up. Derek's voice was low and stiff as he shouted, "You're harassing my wife and scaring my son. She hasn't done anything wrong." Thompson's jaw clenched as he stated, "Your wife was unable to provide sufficient proof for using the accessible entrance." Derek wanted to know what the problem was. She gave you her medical certificates, didn't she? He shot back. She has every right to be here just like anyone else. He flicked back to Maria as if she were an unruly kid, and she refused to comply with my directions. Dirk's fury has reached a boiling point. Derek laughed and added, "This isn't an active investigation." The officer's eyes tightened and he said, "Sir, you need to calm down." His hand moved closer to the radio that was on his shoulder. "You're interfering with an active investigation." The audience, which had been getting larger by the minute, started to grumble more loudly. The tension was evident, and there was a combination of interest, worry, and fury circulating in the air multiple times. An investigation. This is you misusing your authority. People continued to film the interaction with their phones held high as they caught every word and every movement. Thompson's colleague, a younger officer with a stern demeanor, moved up and said, "Sir, if you don't step back immediately, we'll be forced to detain you. He warned you for obstruction, and this is your final warning." Derek moved closer to Maria and positioned himself between her and the police. He said in a low and icy voice, "You are the ones who need to back off, but you are the ones who are causing the obstruction." Officer Thompson's patience had run thin. He gestured to his colleague, who grabbed for the shackles on his belt. "If that's how you want to play, play it." Thompson said, "Then you're both going with us." Maria's breath seized in her throat, panic flashing in her eyes. "No," she shouted out. "You can't do this, he's just trying to protect us." The officers ignored her. Thompson moved toward Derek with a determined stride. His partner, trailing close behind Derek, braced himself, his fist clenching at his sides as the officers closed in before he could react. Tom reached out and shoved Derek hard. The power of the shove drove Derek staggering, but he soon recovered his footing. His visage darkened with fury. The audience gasped in horror, and many voices screamed for the police to stop Jordan, who was still clutching to Maria's leg. Derek was pushed in the chest, which caused him to fall backward. Sob uncontrollably. "Daddy, don't let them take you," he begged, his little voice quivering with dread. Maria's heart hammered as she watched the pandemonium unfold. It seemed as if the whole world had fallen into madness, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Everything she could do to stop it, her voice trembling as she yelled, "Leave us alone, we haven't done anything wrong." Thompson's partner grabbed Derek by the arm and yanked it behind his back as he reached for the handcuffs. "You are under arrest for obstruction and resisting an officer." "Officer," he stated that Derek battled against the officer's grasp, his face twisted with fury so that he could release go of me. He screamed that you have no right to do this as the officer dragged Derek's arm higher, and he frowned in disgust at the utter silliness of the situation. The scenario hit him like a blow. He was an FBI agent who was being mistreated by cops who didn't even know who they were dealing with. However, admitting his identity in this heated environment would only make things more complicated, so he needed to find another means to get out of the situation. The younger officer paused for a moment before looking at the older cop. "De-escalate the situation. Look at my wife," Derek said, his voice strained with desperation. "She's pregnant and in a wheelchair. Is this how you treat people who need help?" Toward Maria, who was sitting slumped over in her wheelchair with tears running down her face. But Thompson's barking command broke through the momentary lapse in action. He cuffed him and placed him in the car, and then he snapped, "We'll deal with her next." Dirk's heart was constricted at the moment. He knew he couldn't allow this go any further, just as the younger officer was ready to tighten the cuffs around Dirk's wrists. The term resonated in his head like a threat, and his eyes flashed to Maria and Jordan, who were both shaking with dread. He knew he couldn't let this go any further. Then, a voice from the crowd went out loud and clear, saying, "This is wrong. They haven't done anything to deserve this." The voice that was heard was that of an elderly lady who had been watching the whole situation develop. She walked forward and raised her hand. "Not phone in the air, I've been filming the whole time," she added. "And I'm not the only one. We all watched what you did." Other people who were watching joined in, and their voices became louder as they yelled at the cops to halt the tension that was in the air. Thompson fired a scowl at the audience. But the pressure from the observers was getting too great to ignore. Maria, seizing the opportunity, found her voice again, and she pleaded, "Please just listen to us," with her voice cracking with emotion. The atmosphere was electrifying, and the environment was on the verge of being chaotic. "You don't have to do this," but Thompson wasn't backing down. He took a step toward Maria, his eyes steely with resolve. "Ma'am, you're obstructing an investigation and refusing to comply with lawful orders," he stated in a harsh tone. "We're going to have to do this," Maria shouted out, her hands shaking as she grasped the armrests of her wheelchair. "I can't go anywhere because I'm pregnant and I need medical care," she said. "I'm going to have to take you in as well." The words impacted her like a blow to the belly. For the first time, Thompson's partner seemed uneasy. He glanced back at the audience, which was now yelling for the cops to stop. Several people were putting their phones up to record every second of the confrontation. The pressure was increasing, and even Thompson appeared to recognize that the situation was becoming more difficult. Steely, he continued in his voice, "Either you cooperate or we're going to have to use force." Dirk's thoughts raced as he battled to keep his composure as the situation was spinning out of hand. Instead of backing down, he doubled down and said, "I'm giving you one last chance." Against the handcuffs that were now loosely dangling from his wrists, he had to move quickly. With one last surge of power, he twisted his body, breaking free from the younger officer's hold. Derek rushed forward and took the initiative before Thompson could respond. When he yelled loud enough, the word erupted out of him with such intensity that it seemed to freeze time. The crowd went quiet, and all eyes turned toward him. Derek reached into his pocket and drew out his FBI badge, holding it high so that everyone could see that he is a federal agent. He repeated it in a voice that was clear and forceful, and he added, "You are violating the rights of my family." Thompson's face became pale as the badge glinted in the sunshine. He took a step back, and the entire weight of what was occurring finally began to set him. The audience exploded into a chorus of yells and applause. The pressure on the cops became difficult to ignore as Derek raised his badge over his head. The balance of power changed, and the officers suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of the situation. The officer hesitated, his hand still on the cuffs, and confusion flickered in his eyes. Derek's declaration hung in the air like a stark challenge to the authority of the officer, and the badge in his hand glinted like a symbol of defiance, and the situation was far from over. Derek was defensive, but the situation was far from over, and he knew that what happened next could determine whether this day would end in justice or further chaos. In the instant when the crowd's response, which included applause, yells, and whispers, increased, it seemed as if the tide had changed in favor of Derek and Maria. However, as Derek raised his badge over his head, he could see the mixture of astonishment and rage in the faces of the people around him. Officers, Thompson's eyes, the argument was not even close to being over. Thompson's face was flushed with fury as he absorbed Dirk's revelation. He clenched his teeth, refusing to be outdone. "I don't care who you are," he said. The officer yelled at Derek, pointing his finger at him, and said, "You are obstructing police work, and your badge does not give you a free pass to interfere. You need to back down now or we will charge you with resisting arrest." Derek's jaw hardened as he felt. His fury was rising once again, and he responded by saying, "You don't seem to understand what's happening here." He then went on to say, "You're violating our rights, and I'm telling you to stop. This isn't about resisting arrest. It's about defending my family from being abused." The younger officer who had been there earlier had said, "I'm telling you to stop." Thompson, who had been standing behind Thompson, took a cautious step backwards. His glance wandered uncomfortably between Derek and the throng. "Sir, perhaps we ought to just let this go," he mumbled to Thompson. His voice was barely heard above the uproar, but Thompson's pride had already taken over. He had already been hurt, and he was not about to back down in front of a crowd, particularly not when his authority was being questioned so openly. He turned to his colleague and yelled, "No, we're not going to let this go. We're going to do our best." And without uttering a single word, Thompson took a step toward Maria, who was sitting in her wheelchair with her eyes wide with terror. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for obstructing a police investigation," he said in a commanding manner. "You need to come with us right now." Maria's eyes were wide with fear. This caused her hands to quiver as she tightened her grasp on the armrests, and a surge of terror coursed through her. She was stuck in her chair, helpless, and now they were threatening to arrest her. Her breath caught in her mouth as she heard the words. She was a pregnant lady in a wheelchair who was facing arrest for merely attempting to use an accessible entrance. She responded, her voice shaking, "I'm not doing anything wrong. I've shown you my documents. I just want to take my leave." The ridiculousness of the situation hit her like a blow. She was a pregnant woman, kid to enjoy the park, but Thompson was unmoved. His hand reached for the cuffs on his belt, and the crowd erupted in a fresh wave of outrage. "You can explain that to the judge," he said dismissively, as though her pleas meant nothing to him. Derek's son was unable to comprehend what was going on. The man's pulse raced as he saw Thompson move toward Maria with his hands clutching the cuffs. There was no way he could allow them to take her away. Not like this, not in front of Jordan. Derek admonished him in a quiet voice that he was making a major mistake. Threatening a law enforcement officer now, he taunted, "I advise you take a step back before you make things worse for yourself. But if you arrest her, you will be facing more than just a complaint. You will be facing federal penalties." Thompson scoffed at Derek's statements. Suddenly, the tension in the air was oppressive, and some members of the audience yelled at the officers to stop, their voices laced with anger and astonishment. Some of the crowd members even moved closer to Maria, giving the impression that they were prepared to intervene if the situation became more serious. Officers continued to press Jordan, who had been quiet for a few minutes at this point. He spoke out with his voice, saying, "SM's small and trembling mommy, don't let them take you." He moaned, clutching to her leg with all of his effort, and his face was covered in tears. As she reached down to touch Jordan's head, her hand was trembling and she said, "It's okay, baby." Maria's heart was torn apart by anxiety and the sight of her son's terror. A lump formed in her throat as she reached down to touch Jordan's head. Thompson, however, was not interested in hearing any more excuses, so he stepped behind Maria and reached down to take the handles of her wheelchair. He stated, "You're coming with us," in a tone that left little room for interpretation. Despite the fact that her own voice was filled with fear, she was not going anywhere. As he started to move the chair backward, Maria screamed out in agony while gripping her stomach. She felt a painful spasm shoot through her body, and she jerked her body instinctively. She let out a gasp, which appeared to stop the audience for a time due to the suddenness of her response. Made Thompson stop, but his demeanor remained hard. "Let's not make this more complicated than it has to be," he hissed, though there was a flash of uncertainty in his eyes. Dirk's thoughts raced as he saw the painful look on Maria's face. He knew he had to do something about it. The audience erupted once again in indignation. "Mountain, you are going to injure her." He took a step forward, lifting his voice over the clamor of the throng, and screamed that she was in agony. He emphasized that she needed medical assistance rather than handcuffs. The grasp that Thompson had on the wheelchair tightened as he looked about at the rising number of observers, the cameras that were fixed on him, and the faces that were contorted and disgusted by his conduct. His jaw was clenched. Her one person cried, "She's pregnant, what's wrong with you?" As the younger officer, who was obviously concerned by the developing events, came to the realization that he was fast losing control of the situation, he put his hand on Thompson's shoulder and asked him to stop. His voice was quivering as he said, "This is getting out of hand for a moment." Despite the fact that Thompson's determination seemed to falter, his pride prevailed, and he replied through clenched teeth, "We're going to do this by the book." He then glanced down at Marie, who was still holding her stomach tightly. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to take you to court." To apply more force, Maria's breath came out in short gasps as she battled to maintain her composure. The pain in her abdomen was still sharp, and the idea of being taken away in her state filled her with terror. She glanced up at Derek, her eyes pleading for aid. Derek's mind was filled with a sense of urgency. However, he could see that words alone were not going to de-escalate the situation, now that the cops were too eager to exert their authority, and the mob was too upset to be silent for much longer. He understood that he needed to do something dramatic in order to alter the situation. With a sudden surge of determination, Derek lifted his badge once more and took a step toward the officers. "I'm ordering you to stand down," he shouted, his voice ringing with the urgency of the situation, determined to take control of the situation before it escalated into violence. "Authority, this lady is my wife and she is in medical trouble. You are breaching federal law by continuing to imprison her under these conditions." The declaration caused a collective gasp from the audience, and for a short second, Thompson halted as he considered the significance of Derek's remarks. The power of the badge and the gaze of the rising number of witnesses seemed to push down on him all at once, but rather than giving in, he sneered at Derek, defiance glinting in his eyes. "You think you're above the law because you're with the FBI," he spit out here. "We make the decision to make the arrest." Regulations. Derek's blood boiled at the arrogance and cruelty in Thompson's tone. "And I'll make sure you answer for violating them." He shot back, his voice laced with fury in a flash. Thompson grabbed on the wheelchair again, his face twisted in rage. The chair jerked backward. This caused Maria to scream out once again, her hands clenching the armrests as she attempted to prevent herself from collapsing. The sheer savagery of the deed sparked something in the audience, a tipping point when the fury converted into a desire to act in a number of different ways. People went closer to the officer, putting more gap between themselves and him. "You're going to hurt her. Stop," said one lady, her voice shaking with anger. "We're not going to let you do this." Abruptly, a guy in his 40s pushed closer to the officer. The man's statements were followed by others in the audience who repeated sentiments of support and outrage against the police. Thompson, who saw that he was losing, he shouted to Derek, "Let us help," and he said it hurriedly. "You're right, we can't let them get away with this." Control took a step back and grabbed for his radio. "We need more units here," he yelled into the receiver because the situation was getting worse. The younger officer turned to Thompson, and his expression was one of uncertainty and fear. "Perhaps we ought to take a step back," he murmured. His voice was barely above a whisper, and he continued, "It's not worth it." Thompson's expression darkened, but before he could answer, Derek took advantage of the temporary attention by stepping closer Maria and grasping the wheelchair handle himself. "Get your hands off of her," he hissed. The two men met eyes, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if the situation might escalate into violence. However, the sound of sirens in the distance burst through the commotion of the throng, indicating the coming of more cops. Derek felt a rush of excitement. His voice was icy and hard. He went down to Maria, his voice low but determined, and whispered, "I'm not going to let them take you." He continued, "We'll fight this together, whatever it takes." Maria nodded her head, indicating that she was in agreement with him. This was his final opportunity to change the way things were going to turn out. Mixed with perspiration as she gazed up at him, "I know," she murmured, her voice full of a desperate hope, "we won't let them win." When the extra cop vehicles came, the atmosphere buzzed with tension, an unspoken recognition that what occurred next might alter everything. The atmosphere was heavy with anxiety as the sirens sounded louder, indicating the coming of more cops. The throng rushed forward, their voices a cacophony of wrath, indignation, and worry. Maria grabbed the arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles white as she did so. As the police vehicles came to a screeching stop and numerous officers poured from their expressions, Derek stood protectively in front of her, stubborn and immovable. He knew that this moment would decide everything, including the safety of his family, his profession, and the message that they would convey to others who were watching. Mixture of confusion and readiness to act, one of them, a sergeant with a stern face and a commanding presence, marched toward Thompson, who was still trying to maintain control of the situation. "What's going on here, Thompson?" the sergeant demanded, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Derek Maria. Thompson moved toward the sergeant, his face a mask of fury and injured pride, and he spit at the guy, jabbing a finger into Derek. The crowd was upset, and we received a request for backup, but it does not seem that this is any type of significant threat. His wife refused to participate with the inquiry, and they have been obstructing justice. The sergeant's eyes turned to Derek, and then to Maria, who was sitting slumped over in the wheelchair with her palm resting protectively on her pregnant tummy. His wife had interfered with a valid investigation, and now the crowd is getting out of control. "You are detaining a pregnant lady," he said with a touch of disbelief in his voice, "and she is refusing to comply," Thompson snapped. And this gentleman he looked at with a tiny softening of his gaze, as if the absurdity of the situation was starting to register. Nodded at Derek once again, and said that he is affiliated with the FBI. The sergeant's eyebrows flew up at the mention of the FBI, and he turned to Derek with a tone that was dubious but more measured than Thompson's. He inquired, "Is that true?" The moment had come to properly impose his authority and make it apparent who they were dealing with, and Derek's heart accelerated. He had kept his badge visible, but the time had come to make it plain who they were dealing with. He moved forward, his voice firm but laced with urgency, and he stated, "This is an FBI agent." Holding out his identification once again, Derek Carter, "And I can tell you right now that what's happening here is a major violation of my wife's civil rights." The sergeant examined the badge, and then he looked at Derek's face as if he was assessing the veracity of what was happening. Meantime, Thompson's visage darkened even more, his pride hurt by the thought that he could have overstepped his limits. However, rather than back down, Thompson sneered and snarled that just because you flash a badge doesn't imply that you are entitled to anything. The words, "I'm not the one breaking the law here, you've threatened my pregnant wife with," came out of Derek's mouth with a bite. Derek felt a wave of rage build in his chest, but he managed to keep his tone under control even as his words came out. "Because you decided to treat her like a criminal, rather than a person, you have placed your hands on her, grabbed her wheelchair, and escalated the situation to the point that you have called for backup. This is all because you have chosen to arrest her, despite the fact that she has provided medical proof." Individual who needs aid. The crowd's murmurs got louder, their support for Derek and Maria growing more audible as they listened to the conversation. Many people screamed out in agreement. While others kept filming the situation on their phones, the sergeant's expression altered slightly, and he took a step back, giving Thompson a hard look. He asked, "Is this true?" And then he laid his hands on her. Thompson bristled, crossing his arms defiantly, and because she was resisting, he said, "We had to maintain control." This situation was getting out of hand, and she refused to comply with my directions. Derek intervened abruptly. She wasn't protesting. She was in agony. "Look at her. She's a pregnant lady who is confined to a wheelchair. What kind of danger could she possibly offer to you?" The sergeant's jaw. He gritted his teeth and took another look at Maria. She was breathing rapidly, and it was evident that the stress of the argument was taking its toll on her. His eyes softened as he took in her state and her obvious fragility. He peered back at her. Before Thompson could react, Derek stated in a chilly tone, "You ought to have exercised more discretion." Thompson's countenance hardened and he replied, "This does not sound like the kind of situation that required this level of force." He moved closer, his voice becoming more louder and filled with righteous wrath. "This is the reason why people don't trust the police," he yelled, addressing not just Thompson, but also the other officers, when those who are meant to be in charge of the situation were not doing their duties. Protect and serve behave with this type of arrogance and disrespect for the rights of the public. It damages the very fabric of our society. His remarks appeared to strike a chord not only with the throng, but also with the people who were listening to them. Even though there were other police there, some of them shuffled uneasily, while others exchanged anxious looks. The tension in the air appeared to increase, but there was also a feeling that something had changed, as if something had broken in the officer's body. The unified front Thompson, on the other hand, was not going to back down. His pride had been hurt too deeply, and he had already spent too much in this conflict. He took a step toward Derek, his voice dripping with emotion. "You think you can come here, flash your badge, and act like you're above the law," he continued. "Just because you work for the federal government does not mean that you get to do whatever you want." Derek's patience eventually ran thin, and he took a long breath before locking eyes with Thompson. "This isn't the case." The sergeant intervened between them and stated, "It's about you abusing your power, and if you don't de-escalate the situation right now, I will make sure there are consequences for you and for everyone involved in this abuse." He said this in a tone that was deadly calm. "It's about me being above the law." He raised his hand as if to physically separate the two men sufficiently. He stated in a forceful voice, "We are not going to continue this in front of the entire park." He turned to Thompson, his look a combination of wrath and annoyance, and he commanded that we are not going to continue this. Thompson seemed to be ready to argue against the sergeant's decision to arrest her, but the sergeant's authoritative tone left little room for disagreement. Thompson turned back toward Maria and Derek, his visage steely but not as angry as it had been before. "This issue has gone far enough. Overtly antagonistic as before, we'll let you go," he said in a stern tone. "But this isn't over. I'll be filing a report about this incident." Derek shook his head, his gaze still fixed on Thompson, and he answered calmly, "And I'll be filing a report of my own concerning this incident. I'll make sure that this gets sent up the chain." The crowd started to disperse slowly, the tension gradually receding as people realized that the immediate prospect of arrest had passed. Maria sagged back in her wheelchair, relief and tiredness pouring over her. All at once, Derek crouched down and shifted his position. He reached out to grab her hand. His hold was warm and solid, and he murmured, "It's okay. We're going to fight this." Maria nodded and squeezed his hand in response. She realized that this was only the beginning, and that they had just escaped the worst of what might have occurred. But there was still a chance that they would lose. Derek rose up and turned toward the throng, telling them that there was a struggle ahead, a battle for justice, a battle for accountability, and a battle for the many others who had endured similar atrocities and been silent. As the cops departed, and the sergeant led Thompson away, Derek got up and turned toward the crowd. As he spoke, his voice held a weight of resolve and defiance. He proclaimed, "We are not going to let this be swept under the rug." He went on to say that we are going to make sure that this sort of abuse stops. The audience reacted with shouts and applause. There was a rush of camaraderie and support that washed over Derek and Maria. They had taken a stand against injustice, and now they would continue to fight, but not as victims but as champions for change. As they were getting ready to leave the park, Derek assisted Maria in getting into the vehicle. The world appeared to shrink down to just the two of them standing strong in the face of hardship, and their hands were kind as he tightened her seatbelt. He stared into her eyes, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them. He vowed his voice would be firm for you, for Jordan, and for every person who has ever been treated as if they do not matter. Maria gave him a tired but resolute smile and said softly, "We will." The sound of the sirens faded into the distance as Derek started the car and drove away from the park. The weight of the situation was getting heavier. Of the day was still thick in the air, but even as they left the location where the encounter had taken place, they realized that their struggle was far from over. It was only just starting. The days that followed were a flurry of phone calls, meetings, and media attention. Derek and Maria's fight was only just beginning. Encounter with Officer Thompson had spread like wildfire throughout social media in the form of footage filmed by witnesses. These films were repeated thousands of times on news channels and internet platforms, with titles such as "FBI Agent Confronts Local Police in Defense of," "A Pregnant Wife," and an event that occurred at an amusement park. Sparks' indignation over the actions of the police splashed across televisions, turning their personal battle into a national discourse. Derek sat at the kitchen table surrounded by bundles of legal documents. With the help of papers and a phone that was continuously ringing, he had gotten in touch with an attorney who was an old acquaintance and specialized in human rights issues. Together, They were getting ready to submit official charges against Officer Thompson and the local police department. Derek's fingers were tapping. He sat restlessly on the table, his thoughts racing with the events of the last few days and the long struggle that lied ahead. Maria stated as she sat across from him, her hands resting on her abdomen. Despite the fact that her physical agony had subsided, the emotional toll of the incident still weighed heavily on her, and she would repeat those events. Images in her memory, the officer sneering, the embarrassment she felt, and the panic in Jordan's voice, and each time a pang of agony would rip through her. But behind the pain, there was a rising determination that she wasn't going to allow what happened to her affect her. Do you believe that what happened to her will be just another story that will be forgotten in the next news cycle? Maria questioned in a voice that was low but laced with optimism. Do you think that the police department will hold him accountable? Derek glanced up. Did you think that they would really do something? He knew that change was never guaranteed, that the system had a way of protecting its own, but he also knew that this time they had the attention of the public, and he wasn't going to let that go to waste. He said in a firm tone, "There are too many people watching too many," and he was aware of the fact that he didn't have a choice. "Witnesses, we need to make them behave as if they are on cue." Derek's phone buzzed with another message, this time from a local civil rights group that had taken an interest in their case. The organization was arranging a protest in favor of Maria, demanding for more responsibility, and they were requesting that greater accountability be taken into consideration. Maria went out and placed her hand on the hand of Derek, who they wanted to talk about reform inside the police department. They wanted Derek to tell their experience and keep the momentum for change continuing. She stated in a calm voice, despite the terror that she still felt, that we need to go ahead and do it. Carry if it helps avoid anything like this from occurring to another person, then it's worth carrying. Worth it, Derek gently gripped her palm, feeling a thrill of pride for whatever she had accomplished. She proceeded to demonstrate her power, and he nodded his head in determination, strengthening his resolve. According to his agreement, we will carry it out, and we will make certain that people pay attention on the day of the event. The sky was bright, and there was a little coolness in the air that suggested that autumn was on its way. Derek and Maria stood on a sea of faces. Hundreds of people had gathered on the steps of City Hall, staring out over the city, amassed a collection of Holden placards that stated, "Justice for Maria, put an end to police brutality, and we." I agree with you that the gathering consisted of individuals of many ages, colors, and origins. Derek took a deep breath and glanced at Maria, who was standing next to him. They were united by a shared goal. While he was adjusting the microphone, she gave him a little gesture of encouragement, and he went up to the microphone. He then remained silent. "My name is Derek Carter," and he kicked out his performance by falling over the audience. Their attention was fully focused on him. "I am an FBI agent, a husband and a parent, which is my voice that is carried across the audience that has gathered. In addition, my wife and kid went through something that no family should ever have to go through," and he halted the conversation 2 weeks ago. The recollections of that day kept running through his head, and the wrath that was in Officer Thompson's stomach, the terror that he saw in Maria's eyes, and the sense of helplessness that he had as he sought to. For the sake of safeguarding his family, he funneled those feelings into his words and allowed them to permeate his discourse. We hurriedly headed to the park in search of a day filled with happiness, a day that would bring a smile to my son's face. He persisted despite the fact that he wanted to give my wife a chance to relax, but instead we found ourselves. We were treated like we were being subjected to the type of injustice that far too many people in our nation have been subjected to for far too long. But because of the preconceptions and biases that were there, criminals like us were not taken seriously. Things continue to be much too common in our culture. A murmur could be heard across the large gathering. When Derek saw that many were nodding their heads in agreement, he emphasized his voice. "Becoming more powerful." This is not just about what happened to us. It is about every single one of us. Anyone who has been subjected to harassment or discrimination on account of the color of their skin or because of their conditions. It is about the misuse of power, and it is about a system that has to be changed with. Transformation, and the reason we are here today, is because we are not going to be quiet any longer. The audience exploded in applause, and their voices rose in solidarity with Maria, who was standing next to them. Derek stopped what he was doing and reached out to take his hand, giving it a little squeeze for a brief minute. Him to experience hope that maybe they might transform their suffering into something positive together. After his speech, several speakers used the opportunity to say something profound. Community leaders, stage activists, and even a few other people who have been victims of police violence. All of the stories of wrongdoing lent more weight to the need for responsibility, portraying a picture of, image of a community that is united in its quest for change. When the event came to a close, Derek and not only was Maria fatigued when she went home, but she was also shocked by the support they had received. Although they were making efforts to find some peace, the conflict persisted, and Dirk's phone continued to ring frequently. Every interaction is a discussion, with calls coming in from reporters, attorneys, and well-wishers. A reminder of the stakes involved in their conflict was provided by the local police department the next week when they stated that officer. In anticipation of an internal investigation, Thompson had been put on administrative leave. When it came to the inquiry, it was a little triumph, but for Derek and Maria, it was everything. Beginning with their case, they continued to go ahead with their determination to hold Thompson, and not only was the department responsible for what had occurred to them, but it was also responsible for every individual who had experienced abuses of a similar kind. Increasing numbers of national news sources picked up the story, which continued to garner media attention. Tale, as well as shedding light on the structural problems that are at play, Derek discovered. Himself giving speeches at other events explaining their tale and urging people to boycott. Yet he was aware that he was placing himself and his family at the center of attention from the public. They became targets for those who were resistant to change, but he was also aware of the fact that, on a particular evening, as the sun was setting below the horizon, Derek sat in and did this since it was the only way to keep the pressure on. The television flashed in the corner of the living room where Maria and Jordan were sitting, and it showed a news story on the ongoing investigation. As the inquiry was being conducted, Jordan was positioned on the sofa with his head resting on Maria's lap as she softly caressed his hair. There was a voice in Jordan's voice that questioned, "Daddy, are they going to make that mean man go away?" It was a question that struck right to the core of what they were fighting for, and it was imbued with the innocence that people have when they are children. As he leaned forward and rested, Derek cast a peek in the direction of Maria, who gave him a little nod. In all honesty, he answered, "I don't know, buddy, but we're going to do it." His elbows were resting on his knees. "We are doing all in our power to ensure that whatever happened to us does not happen to anybody else, and there are a lot of people who are in this position." Jordan seemed to give this some thought for a little period before gently nodding his head before saying, "I want to believe in that as well." He answered, "To help too when I grow up, so there is no need for anyone to be." Maria's eyes welled up with tears as she listened to her son's words, and she was struck with fear in her heart. She leaned out to give him a deep embrace and said, "You're already helping, sweetie." And Derek felt a knot in his throat as he spoke, and he said, "You're helping open just by being here." As he observed them, he was aware that regardless of how hard the path that lay ahead of them could be, they had something that was worth fighting for. Something that increased the level of terror in every single moment of difficulty. After a number of months, the inquiry was finally finished, and Officer Thompson was subjected to a disciplinary action. After being subjected to public criticism and scrutiny, the agency announced the formation of new training programs and a evaluation of their procedures. It was not the comprehensive change that Derek and Maria had hoped for, but it was important nevertheless. It was an indication that their efforts had been successful, and it was a step in the right direction. In the end, Thompson was removed from his badge and charged with a variety of offenses. The trial was a public spectacle, with testimony from witnesses who testified about his conduct in the park. The voices of individuals who had been motivated by the witness video testimony, as well as the witnesses themselves. The position taken by Derek and Maria, when the judgment was delivered guilty of abuse of authority, and both of them. Derek's inappropriate behavior caused him to clasp Maria's hand, and he felt a weight lift off of his chest. Outside of the courtroom, it was an affirmation that their struggle had been worth it, even if it wasn't a total victory. Derek and Maria stood in the midst of the throng who had assembled once again in jubilation. With their hands interlaced and gazing out over the faces of people who had backed them, they were aware that there was a possibility that they might be successful. Despite the fact that there was still a great deal of work to be done, they were confident in their ability to. While they were leaving the courtroom, they continued to go ahead together. That particular day, when the sun was shining and the possibility of justice for Maria was ringing in the ears. According to what they heard, Derek and Maria left with a refreshed feeling of determination. Purpose. They had confronted the gloom and refused to be broken, and now they were prepared to construct. The quest for justice had only resulted in a future in which no one would have to put themselves through the same terror and suffering that they had gone through. Just started, but they were totally ready for whatever was going to happen next side by side, and I am grateful to you for observing if you are ever alone. Do you want to hear more stories like this one? If you did, please sure to subscribe to our channel and enable alerts so that you don't miss any of them. You won't want to miss any new videos. Check out our other articles for more compelling and motivational content. Your support is very much appreciated. Do share your ideas with us in the comments section. Keep an eye out for further stuff. I am grateful to you.